New political parties, a wild expansion of federal power, and thousands of common folk drunk off their gourd wandering through the White House and breaking furniture? Well, that must mean we're in the age of Andrew Jackson, baby, so if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. So let's begin by stating the obvious, namely that the election of Andrew Jackson in 1828 marked a significant turning point in national U.S. politics. Like, not only did he win office by directly campaigning to the American people, he believed that by his election, he now represented the interests of the American people. And just in case that last sentence didn't fully wake up your emotional goblins whose job it is to turn on your anxiety sweats, keep in mind that constitutionally, it was Congress that represented the people's voice. You see, the framers understood the president as the servant of Congress, and in many ways, that's how George Washington, who often deferred to Congress, carried out his terms in office. But Jackson believed the people wanted him to be their representative, and therefore his presidency was marked by a significant expansion of executive power. Oh, and by the way, if you want Noteguides to follow along with this video and all my videos, check that link in the description. Furthermore, the Jackson presidency was also a turning point because of several other factors. First, he changed how campaigns were run. You see, this election occurred right at the same time that many states were lowering or abandoning property qualifications for voting. And so with universal white male suffrage becoming the norm, a whole lot more common folk were able to vote. And Jackson, by all measures, understood this assignment way better than his opponent, John Quincy Adams. And Adams, marvelous diplomat and statesman though he was, inhabited the old school of thought that said that presidential candidates should not campaign on their own behalf. Instead, Adams believed that he should wait off to the side, and if the country wanted him, they could come and find him. But Jackson was like, hey, hold my hard cider, watch this. And he and his team organized rallies and nationwide campaign stops where Jackson styled himself as a populist who really understood the concerns of the common white man. And while Adams was locked away in his study reading dusty old books in French, Jackson was busy persuading the crap out of the new expanded electorate. And then the second momentous feature of Jackson's presidency is that his election represented a fundamental geographical shift in electoral politics. You see, every president before him was either from Virginia or Massachusetts. In other words, all those other presidents had a closet full of fancy pants. But Jackson was a frontier man, born in the Carolinas, but came of age in the backwoods of Tennessee. And that meant that he was the first president to be elected from the western frontier area of the United States. And that was kind of a big deal because it reflected the way universal white male suffrage was changing the way presidential candidates were chosen. Anyway, by the 1820s and 1830s, two rival political parties had crystallized. You had the Democrats led by Andrew Jackson, and this party was the direct descendant of the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans. And that means the Democrats wanted much of what Jefferson wanted, namely a laissez-faire federal government whose main characteristics were frugality and staying out of people's business. And then you had the Whigs led by our boy Henry Clay, and this party was the direct descendant of the now defunct Federalist Party in the style of Alexander Hamilton. And to be clear, the formal emergence of the Whigs into U.S. national politics occurred later in preparation for the election of 1840. But regardless, the Whigs wanted a stronger federal government that involved itself with sponsoring a national bank and funding for internal infrastructure projects like roads and bridges and canals. Okay, so enough of all that. Now we need to consider the ways in which Jackson expanded federal power and the bitter debates that such expansion caused, and there were three big issues. First, Jackson expanded federal power as a result of the nullification crisis in 1832 and 1833. Now, I hope the word nullification started tinkling a few of your memory bells from Unit 3 because we're about to make a juicy trans-unit connection. So hopefully you remember that in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, two states passed the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions which argued that states had the right to nullify or, like not obey federal laws that they considered unconstitutional. Well, something eerily similar happened during Jackson's presidency. So the debate was about the Tariff of 1828, which was passed under John Quincy Adams' administration. And it was a doozy of a tax since it raised prices on imported goods by 60%. And that was real bad for Southerners because they relied on imported goods on account of their economy was dominated by agriculture. You might even say this tax terrified them. Economic policy dad joke. Nailed it. Anyway, Southerners hated this tax so much that they referred to it as the Tariff of Abomination. So, sounds like they were kind of neutral about it. The point is, Southerners assumed that once Jackson took office, he would lead Congress to abolish the tariff and score a win for the South. However, Northern states benefited from this tariff and was home to many Jackson supporters as well. And so, being in such a political pickle, Jackson did nothing about the tariff. And as it turned out, such a move enraged his own vice president, John C. Calhoun, who himself was a South Carolina man. And as a result, Calhoun encouraged South Carolina to nullify this law because by their reckoning, it clearly exceeded the constitutional boundaries of federal power. And then things got worse after a couple years when Congress, with Jackson's support, passed the Tariff of 1832, which extended the same high tariff rates for another 4 years. And so in response, South Carolina issued an ordinance of nullification which declared that the state would not collect federal import tax revenue and that if the federal authorities attempted to override their ordinance, South Carolina would go ahead and secede from the Union. And this is what became known as the nullification nullification crisis. Now, Jackson took pride in being a war hero, and he had no patience for sassy, recalcitrant, nullifying nonsense. So, after Jackson was re-elected in 1832, he expanded federal power by leading Congress to pass the Force Bill, which gave Jackson authority to send federal troops to South Carolina in order to collect the taxes. In other words, if a measly state was bold enough to challenge the great Andrew Jackson, then he was going to send the soldiers down there to smack the nullification talk right out of their mouths. But to be fair, in threatening said smackdown, Jackson also agreed to work with Congress to get the tariff rate lowered, which he was able to do. And in that way, South Carolina was able to back down from its threats while still saving face, but the outcome was clear. Federal power had won the day. But in order to throw one last jab at the beefy federal monster, the South Carolina legislature passed a resolution nullifying the Force Bill, which was kind of petty, but also kind of awesome. Okay, now the second way Jackson expanded federal power was during a development known as the Bank War. So just before the election of 1832, the charter for the Second Bank of the United States was up for renewal, and Jackson aimed to veto that charter. And he branded the national bank as a monster that benefited elites and harmed ordinary Americans, and that wasn't that hard of a sell since the economic hardship of the Panic of 1819 still lingered in recent memory. Anyway, Jackson's opponents in Congress hoped that Jackson's veto would weaken his chances in the upcoming election of 1832, but it in fact had the opposite effect. By framing the veto as a move that protected the interests of common farmers and laborers, Jackson enjoyed a massive wave of support from these people. And soon after his veto, the Second Bank of the United States closed its doors since Jackson refused to deposit federal funds into its vaults and instead deposited them across several other banks in states that were loyal to Jackson. And that's why his opponents called these Jackson's pet banks. It was a major expansion of the president's power because he single-handedly determined the domestic economic policy for the United States. And finally, third, Jackson expanded federal power by means of his efforts to remove American Indians from their ancestral lands. Now remember that Jackson gained his war hero reputation first as an Indian fighter during the Seminole Wars in Florida. And so once he became president, he was eager to help state governments in Georgia, Florida, and the Carolinas, and Illinois to remove the American Indians from their own borders. And the most notorious example was the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and we're going to focus specifically on the Cherokee people of Georgia. Now, of all the American Indian groups that lived within the borders of the United States, arguably it was the Cherokee who ought to have been the best protected from removal policies. And that's because under the leadership of their chief John Ross, the Cherokee adopted the policy of assimilation, which meant that they believed their best means of self-preservation was to adopt the trappings of American culture. For example, they had written themselves a constitution that formed a Republican-style government on the model of the United States. They also learned English and dressed in American-style clothing. But once gold was discovered on their land, Georgians got real hungry to move on in and get rich. And so John Ross reached out to Jackson and tried to convince him to recognize Cherokee sovereignty, but Jackson responded by leading Congress to pass the Indian Removal Act. And under this law, the Cherokee, as well as several other American Indian groups, would be forced to exchange their land in various states for land in the unorganized territory west of the Mississippi River. Now, in this particular case, the Cherokee resisted such policies, and they did so through the American court system. And eventually, their plea came before the Supreme Court in a case called Worcester v. Georgia, and it might shock you to learn that the court sided with the Cherokee and upheld their sovereignty in their own lands. But remember, Jackson believed that he represented the will of the people, and what the people of Georgia wanted was the removal of the Cherokee. So Jackson refused to execute the court's ruling and made plans for Cherokee removal anyway, which began in 1838. It was a 1,000-mile march that became known as the Trail of Tears because of the harsh conditions that led to thousands of deaths along the way. However, in other cases, American Indians resisted removal by means of violence, as they did in the Black Hawk War of 1832. So in that year, Jackson sent federal troops into western Illinois to force the Sauk and Fox nations to move westward. Their chief, Black Hawk, retreated into the Wisconsin Territory and then gathered 1,000 fighters to meet the U.S. troops at a place called Bad Axe. The result was a massacre of the American Indians and the forced removal of the survivors. Okay, so clearly Jackson was a glutton for federal power and didn't seem to care who he mowed down in order to get what he believed was best for America, which in many ways was really what was best for him. But in all fairness, there are a couple of examples where Jackson actually did not make use of federal power, but instead restrained himself. First was regarding the debate about federally funded internal improvements to the United States. For example, the bill that authorized the construction and funding of the interstate Cumberland Road was signed by Thomas Jefferson, but since it was a massive project, it took several decades to finish. The National Republicans and later the Whigs approved of federal spending on this interstate road because it would both facilitate westward migration and help connect Western farmers to Eastern markets. But the Democrats, led by Jackson, invoked the fear of growing federal power at the expense of the states. They believed an interstate road would be unconstitutional because the Constitution did not explicitly grant that power to Congress. And then the second major example of restraint from Jackson was the question of the annexation of Texas. So by 1821, the Mexicans had successfully rebelled against the Spanish and become an independent state. And one of their main problems was the abundance of Comanche raids in the Northern Territory. So their solution was to invite westward migrating Americans to settle in the Texas Territory. And even though Mexico had abolished slavery, they made made a special exception for American planters looking to bring slavery with them into the territory. However, Americans be Americans, and it was soon apparent that the settlers were in no way interested in respecting the rules the Mexican government gave them as conditions for their settlement. And soon, because the Texas plains contained such good soil for planting, the American migrants began to demand independence from Mexico and later started a war of independence. Now, long story short, under the leadership of Sam Houston, Texas rebels won the war with financial help from the U.S. federal government, and Texas became an independent nation. And Jackson, though he did long to admit Texas into the United States, exhibited caution because he didn't want to start a war with Mexico by either recognizing Texan independence or by hinting at plans to annex the new state. And since he was finishing his second term and would be leaving office, he didn't want the debate about Texas to split his party going into the 1836 election. So Congress passed a gag rule which forbade them from considering the Texas question, particularly the slavery question, until after the election. But even with those two examples of restraint aside, there is no doubt that the presidency of Andrew Jackson led to a massive expansion of federal power and a turning point that will forever change presidential politics. Well, okay, you can click here to watch my other videos on Unit 4, or you can click here to grab my video note guides, which are going to help you get all the content of this course firmly crammed into your brain folder. I'm glad you came around, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.